There is a place on this planet where the ocean itself tries to kill you slowly, crushing wood and steel with the same patience it uses to grind stone into sand, and in the year 1915, 28 men watched that patience destroy their ship piece by piece while they stood on the ice and did nothing but wait. No war was being fought. No enemy was hunting them. And yet every single one of them expected to die there, thousands of miles from anyone who could help, in a place so hostile that even the maps of the time simply marked it as empty white space. This is not a story about a battle. It is a story about something far stranger, a group of ordinary men who were left with absolutely no way out, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found one anyway. Their names have mostly been forgotten by history, but the man who led them has not, and if stories like this pull you in, the kind where survival itself becomes the plot twist, you may want to subscribe now, because what happened to these men over the next year and a half still leaves rescue experts shaking their heads in disbelief today. It began with an idea that, on paper, sounded almost noble. A British explorer named Ernest Shackleton set out to do something no one had ever done, to cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, from one side to the other, through territory so extreme that even reaching its coastline was considered an achievement. His ship was called Endurance, a name that would soon feel less like a choice and more like a prophecy. He gathered a crew of scientists, sailors, and adventurers, men who signed up for glory and discovery, fully aware of the danger but almost certainly unprepared for what that danger would actually look like once it arrived. The Antarctic Ocean does not simply freeze the way a puddle freezes in your backyard. Ice at that scale behaves more like a living creature, expanding and contracting with temperature and current, closing in around ships not all at once but slowly, deliberately, the way a hand might close around something it intends to keep. By January of 1915, that is exactly what happened to Endurance. The ship became trapped in pack ice while still nearly 100 miles from the coastline it needed to reach. At first, the crew assumed this was temporary, a delay rather than a disaster. They waited for the ice to loosen its grip. Instead, it tightened. For months, the ship sat frozen in place, drifting slowly with the ice itself, carried in a direction none of the men could control, watching the horizon shift without ever feeling the ship actually move under their own power. The days blurred into a strange, suspended routine. Men who had signed up for adventure and discovery found themselves instead playing football on the ice beside their trapped ship, tending to sled dogs, and photographing seals, trying to hold on to some sense of normal life while the temperature outside dropped low enough to shatter metal left unprotected overnight. Shackleton understood something that many leaders in his position might have missed entirely. He knew that boredom and despair could kill a crew just as effectively as cold or hunger, so he insisted on maintaining structure, routines, small celebrations, anything that gave the men a reason to get up each morning inside a world that offered no obvious reason to hope. This is where the true horror of the story begins to take shape, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the slow, grinding realization that the plan they had trained for no longer mattered. There would be no crossing of Antarctica. There would only be survival, and even that was far from guaranteed. By October of that year, 10 months after becoming trapped, the ice finally did what the crew had feared from the beginning. It began to crush the ship. Wooden beams thick enough to support a 3-masted vessel splintered like twigs under pressure the men could hear before they could see, a deep groaning sound that echoed across the ice at night, as if the ship itself were screaming. One crew member later described lying awake listening to that sound and realizing, with a strange kind of calm, that he was hearing the death of the only shelter standing between his body and one of the coldest environments on the planet. Shackleton gave the order that no captain ever wants to give. Abandon ship. The crew watched, standing on the ice in the freezing wind, as Endurance slowly sank beneath the surface, taking with it their only shelter, their only transportation, and any illusion that rescue would come easily. What followed is the part of this story that historians still find difficult to fully explain, because from a purely logical standpoint, this is where the story should have ended. 28 men, stranded on shifting sea ice in one of the most remote and hostile regions on Earth, with no ship, no radio, and no way to alert the outside world that they were even alive. There were no satellites in 1915. There was no way to send a distress signal into space and wait for someone to notice. If these men were going to survive, they were going to have to do something almost unthinkable. They were going to have to save themselves, using nothing but a handful of small lifeboats salvaged from the wreck and whatever knowledge of the sea they carried in their own minds. For months, the men camped on drifting ice floes, watching their temporary world slowly break apart beneath their feet as the southern summer approached and the ice began to melt and fracture. Eventually, the ice could no longer support them, and Shackleton made a decision that still strikes many people today as almost suicidal. He ordered the crew into 3 small lifeboats and set out across some of the most violently unpredictable open water on the planet, aiming for a small, uninhabited piece of land called Elephant Island. They reached it after days of exhausting, freezing rowing through waves tall enough to swallow the boat's hull, and for the first time in over a year, the men stood on solid, unmoving ground. It should have felt like salvation. In many ways, it was worse. Elephant Island was barren, isolated, and completely outside any shipping route. No one in the world knew these men were there. No one was coming to look for them, because as far as anyone back home knew, this expedition might have already vanished into the Antarctic Ocean without a trace, one of countless ships throughout history that simply disappeared and were never explained. This is where the story takes its most desperate turn, and where you begin to understand why people still talk about this rescue over a century later. Shackleton realized that waiting on Elephant Island meant waiting to die. Their only realistic hope was to send a small group across roughly 800 nautical miles of the most dangerous ocean water on the planet, in a modified lifeboat barely 20 feet long, hoping to reach a remote whaling station on South Georgia Island where they might find help. To put that distance in perspective, it is roughly the same as attempting to cross open ocean waters equivalent to the distance between 2 major cities separated by an entire country, except in a boat with no engine, no radio, and constant 50-foot waves capable of capsizing anything smaller than a proper ship. Shackleton chose 5 men to join him on this journey, leaving the remaining crew behind on Elephant Island under the command of another officer, with instructions that, if no help arrived within a reasonable time, they should try to save themselves by any means possible. It was, in effect, a goodbye that no one said out loud. The 16 days that followed have since become one of the most studied survival journeys in maritime history. The boat, named the James Caird, was constantly swamped by freezing water, forcing the men to bail non-stop simply to stay afloat. Ice formed on their clothing and equipment, adding dangerous extra weight to a vessel that had almost none to spare. Navigation was done using nothing more than a compass, a sextant, and brief, fragile glimpses of the sun through storm clouds, calculations so delicate that a mistake of even a few degrees could have sent them hundreds of miles off course into open ocean with no land for thousands of miles in any direction. And here is where the story offers its real turning point, the moment that transforms this from an incredible survival tale into something that modern experts still study for a very specific reason. The navigator on that tiny boat, a man named Frank Worsley, managed to calculate their position accurately enough, using nothing but instruments from another era and mathematics done by hand in a pitching, freezing boat, that they arrived almost exactly at South Georgia Island after 16 days at sea. To take a single sight with a sextant, Worsley had to be held steady by another crew member while the boat pitched violently in the swell, catching only a brief, fragile glimpse of the sun through breaks in the storm clouds, sometimes only for a second or two, before clouds swallowed it again. A single mistake in that measurement, even a few degrees off, would have sent the boat sailing silently past South Georgia entirely, into thousands of miles of empty ocean with no second chance to correct course. Naval historians and modern navigators have since recreated the conditions of that journey using historical instruments, and many of them admit that achieving that level of accuracy under those circumstances borders on the edge of what should have been mathematically possible without a single serious miscalculation. It is not simply a story of luck. It is a demonstration of how far human focus and calculation can be pushed under conditions designed to break both. But even reaching South Georgia Island was not the end of their ordeal. The only inhabited outpost, a whaling station capable of sending help, was located on the opposite side of the island, separated by a mountain range that had never once been crossed by any human being on record. Exhausted, frostbitten, and equipped with nothing more than basic mountaineering gear improvised from what little they had left, Shackleton and two companions began climbing. They crossed glaciers, exposed ridgelines, and terrain so dangerous that professional mountaineers who later attempted to retrace their route, fully equipped with modern climbing gear, described sections of it as genuinely life-threatening even with today's technology. They had no tents, no sleeping bags suited for the altitude, and no way to stop for long without risking frostbite setting in permanently. At one point, exhaustion became so overwhelming that one of the men begged to simply lie down and rest for a few minutes in the snow. Shackleton refused to allow it, waking him again after only 5 minutes and lying to him about how long he had actually slept, understanding instinctively that in that cold, a short rest could easily become a permanent one. At one point, running out of daylight on a slope too dangerous to descend safely in the dark, the men made a decision that sounds almost reckless out of context. They sat down, linked arms, and slid down the mountainside blind, trusting that whatever waited at the bottom would be survivable, because the alternative, freezing to death on an exposed ridge overnight, was a certainty rather than a risk. They survived the slide, and less than a day later, exhausted beyond anything most people will ever experience, they walked into the whaling station at Stromness, barely recognizable as human beings after nearly 2 years in the Antarctic. The first person to see them, a young boy playing near the docks, reportedly ran away in fear at the sight of these 3 ragged, frostbitten strangers emerging from the wilderness. Maybe that reaction says more about this story than any statistic ever could. Think about the last time your body pushed through something you were certain it couldn't handle, a deadline that felt impossible, a loss that felt unbearable, a morning where simply getting out of bed felt like its own kind of expedition. Multiply that feeling by months, by freezing temperatures, by starvation, by the constant awareness that help was never coming unless you found a way to create it yourself. That is the emotional core sitting quietly underneath every technical detail of this rescue. Think, too, about how differently we experience being lost today. Most people alive right now have never spent more than a few minutes without some way of finding their location or reaching another human being, a phone in a pocket, a signal bar in the corner of a screen, quietly reassuring us that we are never truly alone out there. For Shackleton and his men, that reassurance simply did not exist. Every choice they made had to be right the first time, because there was no way to call ahead, double-check the weather, or ask someone else what they would do instead. It is difficult, from the comfort of an ordinary day, to fully imagine what it feels like to be that entirely responsible for your own survival, with absolutely nothing standing between a decision and its consequences. Shackleton wasted no time once he reached safety. Within days, he organized a rescue expedition to return for the men still stranded on Elephant Island, waiting without any knowledge of whether their captain had survived his desperate voyage at all. Weather and ice blocked several rescue attempts, forcing Shackleton to watch helplessly as ship after ship failed to break through, knowing that every delay meant more suffering for the men he had left behind. Finally, months after the James Caird first set out, a rescue ship broke through the ice near Elephant Island. And in one of the most remarkable details of the entire story, every single man who had been stranded there, all 22 of them, was found alive. In an environment with almost no food, no reliable shelter, and no realistic hope of rescue, a group of ordinary men had somehow managed to keep each other alive for months through nothing but discipline, cooperation, and a refusal to give up on the idea that their captain would eventually return for them. To understand why that particular detail still amazes survival experts today, it helps to look at what actually happens to the human body and mind under prolonged isolation and extreme cold. Cold exposure alone is enough to kill within hours without proper shelter, yet these men built makeshift huts from overturned lifeboats and whatever materials they could scavenge, rationing food that dwindled down to seal meat and, eventually, very little else. Psychologists who study isolated environments today, including modern Antarctic research stations, point to group cohesion as one of the single strongest predictors of survival in extreme conditions, often more important than physical strength or supplies. The stranded men on Elephant Island seemed to understand this instinctively, maintaining routines, humor, and a shared belief that rescue would come even when every rational sign suggested otherwise. Not a single member of the entire expedition died during the entire ordeal, a statistic so unusual for Antarctic exploration during that era that it remains one of the primary reasons this particular story is still taught in leadership and survival courses over a century later. Consider what that actually required in practice. 22 men living inside 2 overturned lifeboats for months, sharing sleeping space barely large enough for half that number, rationing food down to whatever seals and birds they could catch, and doing all of this while genuinely uncertain whether their captain was alive, whether help was coming at all, or whether they had simply been forgotten by the rest of the world. Small disagreements in that kind of confinement can spiral quickly into real danger, yet accounts from the survivors describe something closer to dark humor and quiet determination than despair, songs sung around a blubber stove, birthdays still celebrated with whatever small rations could be spared, small routines protected fiercely because routine was the only proof that time was still moving forward toward something. Military organizations, corporate leadership seminars, and psychology researchers continue to study Shackleton's decisions, not because the science of Antarctic survival was especially advanced for its time, but because of how effectively one person managed to keep an entire group focused on staying alive when logic alone offered almost no reason for optimism. There is something in this story that quietly reaches into ordinary life today, whether you notice it immediately or not. Think about the last time you were part of a group facing something difficult, a hard project at work, a family crisis, a situation with no clear solution in sight. The outcome in those moments rarely depends only on individual talent or resources. It depends just as much on whether people continue to believe that things can improve, and whether they keep showing up for each other even when the evidence in front of them says otherwise. That belief, as fragile and irrational as it can sometimes seem, is the same quiet force that kept 22 men alive on a frozen, forgotten island for nearly 2 years. Today, if you search for Elephant Island or South Georgia on a map, you will find them exactly where they have always been, remote dots of land surrounded by some of the coldest, most unpredictable water on the planet. Tour ships occasionally pass by these days, and modern-day Antarctic researchers still reference Shackleton's original route when studying the region's ice patterns and ocean currents, because much of what he and his crew learned through sheer necessity remains relevant to survival science even now, in an age of satellites, radios, and instant global communication that would have made their entire ordeal almost unimaginable by comparison. And maybe that is the strangest part of this whole story. Everything that once made rescue nearly impossible, the isolation, the silence, the total absence of any way to call for help, has quietly disappeared from most of our daily lives. We carry devices in our pockets capable of instantly reaching almost anyone on Earth, and yet we still, occasionally, feel completely stranded in ways no signal can fix, alone with a problem that feels too large to survive. The next time you feel that particular kind of stuck, the next time no obvious way out seems to exist, it might be worth remembering that somewhere in human history, 28 men faced exactly that feeling in its most literal, physical form, and found their way through it anyway, not with technology, but with patience, cooperation, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the story was already over. The next time you look at a compass, even a small one on your phone, or glance at a weather map before stepping outside, notice how easily we now trust that we will always know where we are and what is coming. For 28 men trapped at the bottom of the world, that simple certainty was the only thing standing between survival and disappearing forever, and they found it using nothing but the sky, the sea, and each other.